in 2019 on Mother's Day, which was a Sunday, I got a call from a famous Brazilian politician named Manuela Dávila, who was a two-term member of Congress. And she was also the candidate who ran as vice president for the Workers' Party against the ticket that lost to Bolsonaro in 2018. So she made the runoff. She was the vice presidential candidate. She's a big deal in Brazil. She called me and she said, "Hey, I need to talk to you urgently. About an hour ago, my telephone was hacked, and the hacker insisted on speaking with me, and he showed me all of these private conversations I had with, close colleagues of mine in the Senate and my party and close friends of mine." And I thought, wow, what is this, like a blackmail scheme, or, what does he want? And she told me, he said, "No, actually, I only did that. I only hacked your phone to prove to you that I had the capability to hack the Telegram accounts of anyone in the world that I want. And I've spent the last several months hacking into the phones of some of the most powerful and influential political officials in Brazil, particularly Sergio Moro, who at the time was the Minister of Justice and Public Security for Jair Bolsonaro, the most popular political official in Brazil, because he was the judge who oversaw the anti-corruption probe that sent Lula to prison. And he said, "I have hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of documents that prove grave corruption on the part of the most powerful people." And they talked about what they should do with this material. And she suggested, or he asked, to speak with me, knowing that I had worked on a similar archive in the Snowden case, doing the NSA reporting. So within about 20 minutes, I was speaking to him by computer, and he told me that he had an enormous archive, that he had hacked into these officials' telephones, and that it would change Brazil forever. It would destabilize the government. It would send people to prison. It would prove that the people who were viewed by the Brazilian media and by the Brazilian government as being the most kind of upstanding and ethical were in fact the most corrupt. So I, kind of kicked the tires as hard as I could to make sure he seemed like a real source. And when I had confidence that he was, I told him to start uploading the documents to my phone, and he said okay, and he began uploading the documents to my phone. And 12 hours later, I went to bed. I woke up the next morning. They were still uploading one after the next. And then the same thing the next day, the same thing the next day. And after 8 days, there was no end in sight. And I realized this archive is going to be bigger than even the Snowden archive, which at that point was the biggest leak in modern journalistic history. And so we created a kind of Dropbox. I was very eager to make sure the documents could be stored safely outside of Brazil so that it was out of the reach of the Bolsonaro government. So even if they got a court order or found out what we were doing, remember, the guy that these documents were about primarily was like the attorney general. So he's in charge of the equivalent of the FBI, the NSA, all surveillance, all monitoring, all law enforcement, the federal police, like probably the single most powerful official in Brazil. And he used to be the most important judge. So I thought he could get a judicial order at any moment ordering us to not publish these materials, to turn them back. So I wanted them saved outside of Brazil. And we proceeded to go through the archive. And within like the first 24 to 48 hours, we found evidence of immense corruption on the part of that judge and the part of his team of prosecutors, not just in general, but specifically with regard to how they prosecuted Lula. And just a word about that, because this is the most important part of the story, which is that Lula da Silva was the former president of Brazil. He founded the Workers' Party. He was probably the most important center-left or left-wing political leader of the last half of the 20th century or first half of the 21st century, along with like Hugo Chavez and Fidel Castro in terms of consequence and impact. But in terms of political success, probably the most important. He was, a labor leader. He grew up in extreme poverty, was illiterate until he was 10, lost a finger in a factory. And he became president and presided over extreme economic growth, took millions of people out of poverty. And by the end of his 2 terms, when he was term limited out of office in 2010, he left office with an 87% approval rating. And then his handpicked successor, Dilma Rousseff, who was a former Marxist guerrilla, she was imprisoned during the military dictatorship, was elected and then reelected, but then impeached in 2016. So in 2017, everybody knew Lula was going to run for president again. And all polls showed that he had a 15, 20-point lead over every other candidate, including Bolsonaro. He would have been elected easily, these polls showed. And right at that moment, when he was gearing up to run, they brought very dubious corruption charges against him. They cheated to make sure that it stayed in Sergio Moro's court, even though it wasn't supposed to be there. Sergio Moro quickly found him guilty and sentenced him to a decade in prison. And then a appellate court, which was notoriously subservient to Moro, affirmed the conviction. And when they did that, it rendered Lula ineligible to run. He went to prison. So they took Bolsonaro's primary obstacle to the presidency, Lula, out of the running by declaring him guilty. And then Bolsonaro cruised to victory. And the minute Bolsonaro won, the first thing he did is he turned around and rewarded that judge who found Lula guilty by giving him the most powerful ministry in the country, which was the Ministry of Justice and Public Security. And these documents that our source provided us revealed that the entire thing was a fraud and a scam from the start, that they cheated along the way in every step of the way, that it was politically motivated. And just 2 weeks ago, like 3 months after we began our reporting, Lula was freed from prison by the Supreme Court. And then 2 weeks ago, the Supreme Court invalidated the criminal convictions of Lula, restored his full political rights on the grounds that Judge Moro had acted corruptly. And that means that Lula is now free to run again in 2022 against Bolsonaro, which everyone expects him to do.